Good morning, still morning, yeah, just about. Good morning, church. So as we mentioned, I'm going to give an overview, introduction to the book of Hebrews, rather than our kind of usual diving into a passage. It's been said already in today's service that we need a reminder of what it's like to be in God's presence, and I think that's a kind of very timely theme for the book of Hebrews and what it's encouraging the believers to do. Hopefully this works. There we go. So just to begin with, before I dive into Hebrews, I'm going to reflect on where we're at in our reading through the Bible. Obviously, as a church, we've been journeying through the Bible in 2 years, and I think it's always a good venture to try to better understand the Bible, rather, if you've been reading it for decades or if you've been a Christian for a day. And as Kat already mentioned, we started last January, so we're already into our second year of reading. And myself, I've really enjoyed reading through the Bible, and it's not always easy, but I think it's such a rewarding endeavor to do. And I just feel really, pressed to say this, but, at the same time, perhaps you haven't been following the plan that Lock and Castle has been using, and that's also okay. And, we encourage everyone to join in with the Bible in 2 years. And I hope you don't feel judged if this is something you haven't yet participated in, or if it's something you don't want to do at all at this stage. I just thought I would mention that. Okay, quick question. How many books of the Bible do you think we read in 2024? 7? $33? That's much closer than 7. 21? Not bad. 27? 28. Well done, South. It had to be Jake who said 7 as well, bless you. Yeah, we've actually read 19 Old Testament books and 9 New Testament books. I'm counting Psalms as a book. I know we only read half of it just for the purposes of counting. So, it's been a journey, and it just shows you the breadth of the types of books we've read, the different genres you've been introduced to, the different stories. Can anyone do a quick calculation? And if we've read 28, how many have we got to go? That would be a quick year, that would. It's close. 24 is close. It's very close. 38 to go. It depends, if, I guess for Protestants, we'll just count the 66, right? Yeah, you have more. But anyway, whether you've journeyed throughout the whole year, and you've been following the plan to a T, or you've kind of dipped in and out and read, the books maybe you're a bit more comfortable with at this point. Lots of different feelings and emotions, I imagine, have appeared for yourselves when reading the Bible. You may have struggled to start it at all. You started to do it, but then you found it difficult to keep it up. You absolutely love it. You find it strange, questionable, confusing, irrelevant. You might find it like food for your soul, amazing. It's too ancient. You're kind of glad you've made it this far. You may think, why didn't I start this process sooner? Or for some of you, you read through the Bible regularly anyway. Could have been a mixture of all the things I've said. Lots of different feelings. And despite all that, the one thing I hope has kind of been clear as we've been reading through the Bible so far is this interplay between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The fact that the Old Testament points forward to the New Testament as we see its promises and prophecies of the coming Messiah, who we know was our Lord Jesus Christ. And then the New Testament seems to point back to the Old Testament as it explains to us how and when Jesus fulfilled all of those Old Testament prophecies and promises. And it's not one over the other. Both are important to understand who God is and humanity's story of redemption. And this is going to be a key theme as you read the book of Hebrews, and we'll get onto that now. So the letter to the Hebrews, just to begin with, we won't dwell on this too much, but who wrote it, we don't really know. Could be Paul, Luke, Apollos, Barnabas, Priscilla. There's been lots of speculation over the centuries and lots of debates as to who has written the book. Most of the New Testament letters, we know who wrote them, but Hebrews is kind of an outlier in that regard. There's a quote from 3rd century church father Origen. So he said this over 1,700 years ago. Only God knows who wrote Hebrews. So they weren't really sure in the 2nd and 3rd century, that close to the time of the apostles. So we're happy to maybe just say only God knows who wrote Hebrews. Okay, but what do we do know about the book? We know that the author was known to its recipients, and it is rooted in the teachings of the apostles. That the evidence in the letter suggests it was written primarily to Jewish Christians. Now, that doesn't mean it's not relevant for non-Jewish Christians or it's not relevant for us. I always like the saying that the Bible wasn't written directly to us, but it's written for us. It was likely to have been written before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And again, this is important throughout because you'll see lots of references to the temple and the sacrificial system. There is an assumption in the text that the readers thoroughly understood the Old Testament and the Jewish sacrificial rituals. And this is why I think it's so vital for us to have gone on this journey of reading the Bible and, getting to grips and wrestling with the Old Testament text. Because it's, as we say, it's not always easy to read those books, but you will see a lot of those themes come, pop up throughout Hebrews. Hebrews addresses Christians who are being persecuted and imprisoned, and they are tempted to abandon their faith. And finally, it's a complex text, and hence why some Christians struggle to read it. But hopefully this introduction will help, and there's lots of good resources I'll point out in a little bit as well. So a key theme. The most recurring theme throughout is that Jesus is superior to everything in the Jewish religion to which some of the persecuted believers were tempted to return to. And I think just at this point it's worth saying, when you're reading Hebrews, maybe try and empathize with those early believers. Most of us doesn't know what it's like to be persecuted, and many Christians are obviously persecuted today, and I couldn't imagine the temptation to just, pack it all in and say, you know what, I'm not going to follow Jesus anymore. And that's a position these believers are in. They're being persecuted, and they're tempted to go back to Judaism because that was okay under the Roman Emperor at the time. They wouldn't have been persecuted if they just, went back to their old ways. The author of the book emphasizes over and over that Jesus is greater than the Old Testament prophets, the angels, Moses, Joshua, and the Aaronic priesthood. But because of all of that, because Jesus is greater, there is also a greater cost at turning away from him as well. And you'll see that kind of come out throughout the book as well. I found this quote from, the late Bible teacher David Paulson, and I think it summarizes the book of Hebrews brilliantly. He says, the author of Hebrews' argument is very simple. You are riding in a Rolls Royce now. Do you want to go back to driving an old banger? Do you want to go back to heating the water in a kettle and pouring it into a tin bath in front of the hearth to have your bath? Who would choose to do such foolish things when they have the latest and best available? He, the author, is saying that a return to Judaism is to go back to a far inferior position. And again, just think how that can apply to us, right? Of how easily we can go back to our old modes of behavior or our old patterns of thinking. And we have that temptation to maybe, turn away for Christ, whether that's in a temporary matter. And just before we move on, I just wanted to signpost, this is from the Bible Project, but just to say on the Lock and Castle website, there's lots of really good resources when you come to read in the book of Hebrews. So what I'm going to do now is just show you the kind of introduction to the book, and we'll have a look at this text very briefly. So this is Hebrews 1, verses 1 to 3. In your Bibles, it'll probably say verses 1 to 4 as the introduction. But because verse 4 talks about angels, I'm going to leave that section for you to read when you read it yourself in the week. So this is a summary of the whole book, in a sense. And verse 1, it says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. And we've been reading all about that. in the Old Testament, how God spoke through the prophets in lots of the stories we've been reading about, and also just before Christmas or around Christmas in the New Testament, you even saw prophets like Anna and John the Baptist. So that was the usual mode of how God spoke to his people, through the prophets. Verse 2, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. So a more superior mode of communication through the prophets has arrived. And God's Son, through whom, God made the universe, and that echoes words from John's Gospel. But the stakes are much higher here. Previously, the Israelites did not always take heed of the words of the prophets, who, they're human like us. But now the Son, God made flesh, has spoken, and humanity does not want to make the same mistake of not listening to his words. And that's why it says last days, because, God has spoken in his Son, Jesus Christ. There's no one after him. It's not like a comma on the story, it's a full stop. The recipients of this letter could not claim that they are awaiting further instructions from another prophet or angel, because one who is superior has already spoken. And in verse 3 it says, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. And again, there's that contrast. So in the Old Testament, we read of God appearing to Moses in the burning bush. He led the Israelites a pillar of cloud by day and by fire by night in the wilderness. But now God's made himself known in human flesh, and the people around the time of Jesus they were able to see him and touch him. In the book of Colossians, it talks about Jesus being the true image of God. And if you want to know what God is like, we just have to look to Jesus. And here we see the reference to purification in verse 3, that language of sacrifice that you would have read about in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And this is key to the whole book of Hebrews, is that there's both a continuity and also a contrast. So God spoke then, he also speaks now. We read of God's glory then, and we get to see it now. There was purifications for sins back then, and there's also purification for sins now. So that's the continuity between the Old Testament or the Old Covenant and the New Testament and the New Covenant. However, the way in which God has spoken now is greater than how he's spoken in the past. And God's glory now is greater than God's glory then. And the purifications for sins now is greater than the purification for sins then. And that's the contrast. And you'll see that all throughout the book of Hebrews. These are just some of the references of the Old Testament in Hebrews, and I won't spend a lot of time on here. And maybe as you see that, you can start to think about some of the books you may have read already or be familiar with, some of the passages where you might see, passages around the Sabbath or Melchizedek. I preached on that actually last year. This time last year, I spoke about Melchizedek being a shadow for Christ in the book of Genesis. When you see the blood of animals, maybe you can think back to when we had to read through Leviticus. I know everyone enjoyed that text. And some figures in the Old Testament, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, etc. And all throughout the Hebrews, you will see these Old Testament references mentioned, that continuity, but also this contrast continually throughout as well. Okay, but what does Hebrews mean for us then? So as I said earlier, the original audience of the letter, they were tempted to abandon their faith because of persecution. And I mentioned earlier as well, we may not be facing persecution, but there is plenty we experience that can tempt us to turn from Christ, to abandon our faith. And again, as you read through Hebrews, you want to remember that great cloud of witnesses it mentions in chapter 12. So remember our brothers and sisters in the Lord, and those we read about in the Bible who faithfully served God despite their hardships. And this is why testimonies are so important here, and I really enjoy hearing people's testimonies, because we get a glimpse of how a person, through the help of Christ, has overcome their hardships. And I mentioned this earlier at the 9 o'clock, that when I became a Christian, I was 19, 20, I really struggled with the fact that you're in a community where you have to kind of open up a little bit and, share how you feel. And I think as well, being a man, that's not always the easiest thing to do, right? And what shocked me was when I started to open up to people I trusted as a new Christian, it's, everyone else feels exactly how I feel. They've been exactly through what I'm experiencing now. And you feel encouraged because they've overcome that by the help of God. And so can all of us. And I think that's why it's so important to spend time with one another. Obviously, we do it in our life groups, we fellowship with one another, we share testimonies, because we need to be encouraged. And that's exactly what the persecuted believers at the time needed to hear as well. They needed to hear that your forefathers have experienced hardships, but they still were faithful to God. And you'll see the writer pick up on the fact that in the Old Testament, Noah, Abraham, they didn't have the revelation we have, nor did they experience Pentecost. They didn't have the Holy Spirit like we do. And this is such a key thing for us to remember as well. And just remember that whatever situation you face in 2025, Jesus is greater. Do not be tempted to fall back to your old ways. Stay on the course of faith. Because we're at the beginning of a new year, we have no idea. Some of us may have an idea of some of the hardships we may be facing, some of the trials. But life at times is very unpredictable. And we just have to hold on to that fact that Jesus is greater than any of the circumstances and situations we may face. I'm just going to end on one of my favorite passages in the book of Hebrews about Jesus being our great high priest. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. I love verse 16, like approaching God's throne with confidence. And there we can receive that mercy and grace we need in our times of trouble. So whether you were kind of planning to carry on with the Bible in 2 years and read through Hebrews this week, or maybe you haven't started the Bible in 2 years, this would be a really great book to kind of get into. Although, as I said, it can be difficult at times, but you have resources to help you. Definitely be a great book to start the year on. And as we said, those reminders of God's presence, of God's promises, of his power, his greatness. We all need reminders sometimes. And there's people in this church who'd be happy to answer any questions you have throughout the book as well. And I just think based on the kind of space we've created this morning so far in the worship service, I think if we just have a little bit of space, maybe you just need that reminder from God that he is for you, that he's greater than any situation or circumstance you're going to face, and maybe you're someone who needs confidence to approach God this year. That when you are in those difficult moments, rather than maybe turning back to particular habits or modes of thinking, you can approach God's throne of grace with confidence. We'll pray together.